Hey, Rich. Thanks for the thinking. I love the thoughts and the provocations and the questions and appreciate the format. So here's a reply and let's add something into the mix. So I've been thinking about different levels of organizing for a while now. The idea that when we organize, that it's individuals, small teams, communities, and networks all behave quite differently. And that by differentiating out our organizing systems or our groups into different types of an organizing system, that we can get a lot of useful benefit from it. So I've just put up this thing of different types of things that I've seen around. So for example, down the bottom, we've got tight and loose, and here I've got individual, pod, community, and network. And I think that individual, it's all about people, pods of teams, the community is all about building culture, and networks all about protocols. So, for example, you can see that the relationships you have with your colleagues versus your co-founder are going to be quite different relationships. You need different tools and ways of managing them. Maybe stewarding fits here, maybe friends are here. It's all up for sort of interpretation and different opinions. But looking at the pod level, I found it quite interesting to see that these income pooling pods that Root Systems and the Pandas are experimenting with, they're very tight. They're right on the edge of the tight spectrum. But we've been experimenting with livelihood pods for a while now, like EXP and Craftworks are really good examples of small teams of people using what I call a keep what you kill method. I think we need a better name for that. But the idea is that the money you bring in, you contribute some of it to the core, the rest of it you control. And that it's still a very tight sort of structure. It's just a little bit looser than the income pooling. Then I think you'd have these working groups like the Catalyst or the board, which persist over time. And the tightness or the looseness is pretty much correlated with how much time you spend on it. If we were full-time Catalysts, even if we're not earning money through generating revenue together, it would still be quite a tight structure. Whereas if you're a board meeting once every 2 months, it'd be a bit looser. And then I think there's also these ideas, so that's like the idea of a standing working group, a working group that persists for a long time. Whereas these mission-based working groups or these temporary working groups like the Refactor team or the stewardship agreement, they form, they do something, they disperse. It's a little bit of a looser, or you can see that they might start loose and then go tighter. And so it's going to be a fluid thing of how these groups move. And I think that as we get more thinking about small teams and practices and processes around them, we can really just keep exploring that space. But having this language of a pod, I think, is quite a useful one. But the same at the community level. And I think this is where this thinking has been most useful for me, to say a community is different to a network. A community is got a certain size. A community of 1,000 people doesn't really work. It's not a community anymore compared to if you're talking about a community of 50 people. And I think that you can see here that you can have tight communities and looser communities, like a cohort that we're launching with the cohort experiment. I think that's a community, and you can have individual small pods or home groups within that community, but launching a cohort as a community, I think, is a really interesting experiment. But it's going to be a loose community, whereas you see in Spiral Services, it might be a bit tighter. And again, these all move around, I think. But seeing in Spiral Services not as a venture, but as a community, or seeing in Spiral Labs not as a venture, but as a community made up of pods and products and whatnot, has freed my thinking a bit, and I'm finding that inquiry quite useful. Also noticing that in Inspiral, the Inspiral Wellington community is a very different experience to all the Inspiral remote people's community. And I think that they have different levels of care and attention paid to them. And that having this language of communities and naming them and the membership of them, we get a lot of benefit from. Because I think the main pain we felt with the Inspiral members community has been it started out as a community and it keeps being tugged towards a network level. Every time we add more members in and less members know each other, it starts looking less like a community and more like a network. And that transition zone from community to network, I think, is the challenge we're facing now. So if we start to say Inspiral is a network and we have named communities within it, I think that would be a powerful design position to take. I also think there's something very interesting about platform co-ops in the network level, where it's like, okay, when you've got thousands, tens of thousands of people, maybe the platform co-op language, structure, software is the kind of things you want to be. I also think there's interesting models like the Impact Hub, which is really like a reverse franchise where there's hundreds or however many Impact Hubs around the world who contribute and control a central global entity. And that its network, I think, is a useful way of doing that, because it's all about what are the protocols we use, whereas communities are much more about what is the culture we build. And I think that I found that quite interesting thinking. Also, I found that you can have different rhythms. So this idea of what rhythms do we have as a network community team, and that the smaller you get, the more frequent the rhythms. Individuals have longer cycles too, though. But also the idea here that if it's a small team or a large team, you'll have different frequencies. Like larger, you probably want slower rhythms, smaller, faster rhythms. Tighter, you want faster rhythms. Looser, you want slower rhythms. And it's all about like the attention economy. And here I think we can have a crack at like legal entities. Like here, individual, it's an individual in the law. But with the livelihood pods and labs, I'm starting to explore this idea of, or we're starting to explore this idea of, what if each pod is a company? And it's a very simple company, one share per person, the core team of the directors, and that EXP have done this, Root Systems are doing this, Pandas are doing this. The pod as a company, but it's not a venture, it's a pod. And I think we've got a really good model at the community level of a cooperative of entrepreneurs that in Spiral Foundation, we're a co-op. I think whether we, how much we call ourselves that or not. And what we do is we build businesses. Lots of people might not see themselves as entrepreneurs, but I think most people are actively in the craft of entrepreneurship. And I think the entity that we'd see at the network level is this platform co-op sort of model, which we don't have examples for, but would be fun to build. So that's sort of some thinking at that level. I've got a bit more. So if those levels are all different and you have different structures at them, I think that you can find some principles which you say these are true at every layer of organizing. We value transparency, we value decentralized power and high trust and all these sorts of things. And that when you start to design your systems for those principles, and they might not be these principles, they might be other ones, but I think saying these are our principles we use for designing our organizing systems, we can get a lot of benefit from it. I've also found a lot of benefit from thinking about tensions in designing. So, for example, we value individual freedom quite a lot. We also value collective action, and they're in tension. They pull in different directions. Likewise, if you're having a hard time, find the thing inside yourself which is causing you to have a hard time and fix it. It's your personal responsibility to manage your experience. Is in tension with you're having a hard time, how can I help you? How can I care for you? And I think that you want both. And the way of managing tensions is like, you might have a rhythm, you might do one, then the other, or you might have one at this time or another at this time. But we need to design for these things that are in tension with each other. I found some other ones quite useful too, this idea of open and closed, like, hey, anyone, show up, you're welcome, or invitation only. And you can see this with our contributor joining process and our member joining process. Likewise, I think there's this one of tight and loose, like we know the schedule, this is the blueprint, do not deviate from it, would be a tight structure. And a loose one would be, we don't know what's going to happen. Let's put some ingredients in and see them emerge. And I think by designing for all of these different tensions and principles, we can start to have a cohesive organizing system, which is quite interesting. Don't know what to call these things. Call them constructs. Let's get a name. But I loved your naming of projects. I think that that's something that if we were more explicit about the projects people in the network were building, we would have much richer experience. I'm very obsessed by products at the moment. And I think this idea of how can we get good patterns for building products and understanding what different types of products look like, whether it's a product of I sell websites, web design services, or it's a product like CoBudget or Lumio or whatnot. I think having a language of products is interesting. Events, what events are we running? What are the patterns for events and the different ones? Spaces, digital and physical. We've been doing good stuff with content and channels, but I think we can do a lot better. How are we actively managing for different types of content? How are we actually curating multiple channels? Who is a steward for each channel that we're looking for? Who is the author of the content and whatnot? And then having a swarm of brands around them. And I think that this sort of, the language of project, product, content, channel, space, event, I think could be quite helpful for us in naming some structures of the network. So that's the sort of the top level thinking I've been doing around, if you look at these sort of 4 different layers of organizing, the individual, the small team, the community, the network level, some cohesive principles, some rhythms that work, some legal entities, these tensions of designing and these constructs. And so I just want to finish with a couple of questions. One question which I'm getting a lot of energy from, what if we had no ventures? I haven't mentioned venture in any one of these things. And with Inside Labs, I'm exploring this idea of what if we have pods and they're legal entities, and then we have products and they're contracts, or they might be their own entity as well, and that the products make money and it's distributed to multiple pods who contributed to it or investors or whatnot. But we don't have a venture per se, pods and products. And I think that if you think about this whole organizing system grown up, you could have a venture-free zone, which I think would be quite different to what we've got now and quite curious about. So I'm keen to experiment there. And the other one was, what if we started thinking of ourselves as a tribe instead of a network? Like some of our Indigenous friends are born into tribes and they have this cultural heritage of a tribe and it has a role in their society and their personal and collective lives. What if that's what we're trying to build? What if what we are trying to create here is a tribe which people can join, an intentionally crafted tribe? And again, tribes got lots of language and baggage with it and whatnot, but I think that a tribe is a certain type of network. And what if the next step is finding the other tribes in the world and building a nation with them? And I think that for me, that language of building tribes and nations is so much more viscerally exciting than building a network. So these are two questions that I'm sort of sitting with. So hopefully that's something useful to add to the conversation. Love the format and the invitation. Really love to see anyone else who wants to respond in similar ways or get some thoughts out, and let's do some thinking together. Cheers.